Okay. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today at the Polycon UK webinar. We're very happy to have one also of our regulars, Clement Minaudier, who's at City St. George's University of London. Clement has published in a wide range of outlets, economics and political science, so really spot on for our webinar. He does political economy, organizational economics. He's happy to take questions as we go. But before I give you the floor, I'm going to do the announcement for our next webinar, which is June 1st. So everybody be here. Roy Levy from Tel Aviv, and he's going to present, they're going to present article level slant and polarization of news consumption on social media. So looking forward to that as well. So Clement, you've got 1 hour, and let's get started.
Brilliant. Thanks, Valeria. Thanks to everyone for joining and to our organizers for the invitation. So yeah, this webinar goes way back and it was a real lifeline during COVID. So I'm really happy to and excited to present here. So this is joint work with Greg Chih-Hsin, who's at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. And in this project, we're interested in understanding how media coverage, and in particular, who gets quoted in the media, can affect policy attitudes, and especially how people view policies as more technocratic or more political, how they want them to resolve, and what kind of information they want to seek on the topic. So I'm sure you're all well aware of the increase in polarization that's been happening over the last few decades, and it's been really well documented. There's been a lot of explanations behind it. But one particular type of issue polarization that has been discussed but comparatively less discussed is politicization. So what's politicization is I haven't found any set definition in the literature, but what the literature has been thinking about is issues that are seen as mostly technical, mostly expertise based issues, but that over time start to get divided along partisan lines. So views about these issues should be driven mostly by sort of technical scientific expertise, but instead views start to divide along partisan lines and political lines. So some example of these issues that have become politicized are climate change and the environment more generally, public health, and especially during COVID, the public health reaction and policies around this, and even to some extent central bank independence are all issues that have become politicized. So issues that people used to think are mostly, we should sort of trust the experts on this. There's a technical dimension. People could disagree about them. It doesn't mean that it being not politicized doesn't mean everyone agrees, but a disagreement would be about technical facts, right? Instead, over time, these issues, the disagreement about these issues has started to align with partisan positions. So here's an example that's from, that's from some of his papers on climate change, showing views on climate change and how much we should worry about it and whether it's already begun. That in the 90s there was disagreements, right? So not everyone thought we should worry about it. About 25-30% of people didn't think we should, but that was sort of similar between Democrats and Republicans. And then over time, the level of agreement and disagreement with this type of question starts to shift and polarize across parties, right? So what's behind this? Well, the explanations behind it I kind of actually drawn from the explanations behind polarization, right? So polarization and politicization are two different things, but you can think of politicization as an extreme form of polarization, where we start with sort of no disagreement across parties, but then over time, polarization happens. So typically when we think of polarization, we think of three sorts of interrelated explanations. It can be voter driven, so simply voter have different views on some issues and their views evolve sort of independently over time, and they just happen to diverge across parties over time, right? Now, of course, That's a bit simplifying. People will sort across parties too, so it doesn't have to be purely views changing, but it could be realignment across parties of different types of voters with existing views, etc. But it's sort of a voter-driven explanation. And then there's more politician or elite-driven explanations, which here we can split into two mechanisms. So one being elite cues. So people want to do the right, make the right decision on a policy. But they trust politicians to have more information than them about policies. And so they're going to listen to the politicians and follow them. But they are perhaps more likely to trust politicians of their own party. And if these politicians disagree across party, then the voters are going to start to disagree as well, right? A second mechanism is a bit more of a cynical mechanism. And the first one, it's not purely learning, it's not purely Bayesian learning, is that politicians exploit existing identity cleavages and try to frame certain issues as being identity driven, right? So an example would be, I don't believe, I used to think climate change is, whether it's happening or not, is something that scientists can tell us about. But now I've learned that not believing in climate change is a core part of my identity as a conservative. And so I'm going to say that I don't really believe climate change is happening, right? And then the third kind of category, and I want to emphasize, these categories are not mutually exclusive, right? So one will influence the others, and it's very hard to sort of disentangle the three. A third one is the role of the media in reinforcing these polarizations. So we know there's a large literature showing that media and social media and internet penetration have all sort of help with increasing polarization. And part of it is being exposed to different types of news. And that can be playing a role in this politicization, right? Now, on top of that, there's also studies showing that news about polarization itself can lead to more polarization. So people become more polarized because they learn that there is, divergence of opinions across parties. Right? And finally, that's a little bit related to, there's some recent papers showing how the selection of guests and content or the sources of content that you put in the media can create some political divergence. Even when you think you're inviting potentially independent experts, they might have a political angle which might make people think that this issue is politicized. So the reason I mentioned the last two is because that's kind of what we're going to focus on here. So how the representation of an issue as being divided in the media can then lead to people changing their mind about whether this is a politicized, a political issue or a more technical issue.
Clement, just a little question, especially with regards to your first example on climate change. How can you easily separate politicization and salience? So issues become politicized as they become salient, and maybe we just have technologies to make more issues salient today compared to 40 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because it's true that if you look at this graph, you could think, well, people just didn't have a strong opinion there because they didn't know very much about climate change. And then we've bbeen talking more and more about climate change. And so they've started to rely. Now, the question becomes, I don't think it's necessarily, it necessarily means there isn't some politicization from the sort of elite-driven type here, which meaning that, yes, people might not have been aware, but why is it that there's differential awareness, or that, the awareness then leads to differential opinion? So there must have been a point at which people thought, like, this issue that I didn't know very much about before, I'm realizing it's somehow correlated with the rest of my ideological views. And that's sort of the question of, where is this coming from? Is it that there's always been an underlying correlation and it just becomes salient? Or is it that, parties have been pushing one identity over another? I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, let's see also the rest. And
Max,
thanks.
You press this sort of temporal dimension, that this is a recent phenomenon, and that's the third category of your reasons or drivers alludes to. But we might also think, there are other episodes or incidents of polarizations in the past. I don't know, 1930s or something. That is it really a recent phenomenon, or these things are coming in waves?
Yeah, yeah.
And
No,
can
that's
you
a good
use
point.
that as a method of disentangling?
No, that's a good point. I don't want to make a strong claim because that's not really what the paper is about. That was more to like introduce this. I think, this literature here on the role of the internet and social media on amplifying polarization is pretty like strong and reliable. So I think there has been an increase recently. Is it a general trend over time, or has it been part of a wave that I don't know? But I guess to some extent, to address both of your questions, what we're going to be interested in here is a little bit narrower, in the sense that what we want to understand is thinking about the media, which particular aspect of the media reporting could be one of the drivers of polarization. So I want to emphasize too, we're not going to be trying to disentangle between these theories. In fact, I think is probably very hard to disentangle between the three, because I believe that all three are at play to some extent and reinforcing each other, right? But it's more about identifying whether one particular channel can play a role or can be sort of excluded from the story. So what is that part of media reporting that we're interested in? We're especially interested in quotes here. So that's something that, starting to look at sort of media reporting and media literature, etc., we're starting to open a little bit the black box of media bias and thinking about where that media bias is coming from. And so the Cagé et al. Paper is really about that, like thinking about how that media bias is created. And one angle that I think is interesting is, if you look at the news, most, if not all, news articles contain some kind of quotes. So this is just like a random selection of headlines from The Guardian, like on a given day a couple of months ago. And almost all of the headlines contain some quote, right? You see like the quotation marks everywhere. And that's just the headline. So if you click on the article, you'll get even more of that, right? Meaning that a lot of what journalists do is actually reporting what other people have said, right? And so as part of this reporting, we'll make some choices. We'll choose who to quote. Some of it is politicians, right? Some of it is sort of some kind of experts, judges in the legal case, some NGOs, etc., right? And so that's what we're going to be focusing on here, is what can be the impact of quoting a certain type of person versus another, in particular politician versus experts, right? So these quotes can come from all kinds of different stakeholders, but we're going to be focusing on politicians versus experts. And what we'll want to understand is whether these quotes can influence your views about the policy, in particular, how the policy should be determined, whether it should be determined, decided by politicians or referendum or by experts, and your policy attitude, so whether you agree or disagree with the policy, right? And then another part of the experiment will be looking at what kind of information do you want to look at as a result of seeing these different types of quotes. Okay, so very briefly, why we should be interested in this? Well, it's part of this explanation behind understanding this rise of identity politics, right, or culture war. So the story here would be, if it is the case that media reporting influences whether people see an issue as political or technical, then media reporting can turn some technical issues into partisan issues, and then that can lead to some gridlocks, that can lead to some more disagreement than is needed on pressing issues and preventing us from resolving these issues. It can also contribute to distrust of experts. The mechanism here would be that experts, if you think this is a political issue and you hear an expert who disagrees with you, you might start to think that the expert is partisan, right? Because you think this is fundamentally a political issue. This expert is voicing their opinion on it, so they must be of the other party if I disagree with them, right? And then it reduces your trust, and etc. Conversely, and we'll see a little bit of that, is that exposure to experts can, or rather quoting more experts, could reverse this and make people feel that this is an issue that's more technocratic, where expert opinions are more important, right? And finally, like I said, that's sort of opening the black box of media bias and trying to understand how media can shape not just what people believe, but also what policy dimensions are important and how that influences their future information. Orkun, you got a...
Hi, Clement. Yeah, I was thinking of how to kind of, think about this comparison between experts and politicians. And, sometimes experts themselves can be also categorized as somewhat like, politically motivated agents, right? And they can be, in the minds of the public, they can be situated maybe like on the kind of more liberal, on the more like, progressive left side. How should we think about it? Like they're not neutral agents, right, in the minds of an average voter, and I think especially increasingly so over time, right? Maybe they used to be like that, but not anymore. So like, how should we think about it in your context?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it is generally difficult to separate between experts and politicians. You could also think that there are some politicians that are, very benevolent and have some expertise on an issue, and so they do bring some a partisan expertise. In the context of our experiment, we do ask the respondents how they classify different types of experts along political lines, and the expert quotes that will expose them to are coming from experts that our respondents have generally classified as fairly neutral. So they couldn't, on average, they didn't classify them as too left-wing or too right-wing, right? But I think there's a broader question of, is there such a thing as a neutral expert? We've tried to make them as neutral as we could here, but it's a broader question. I don't know if I'll have a good answer to that. Okay, so I run a bit ahead already, but what do we do in the paper? It's an online experiment. We recruited 2,500 respondents in the UK, but with quotas imposed on age and gender, representative of the country, and also importantly on party affiliation. And so here what we wanted to have is sort of representing the two main parties in the UK. Now we did this after the 2024 general elections. So by that time, the right wasn't really just the conservative anymore. And so we decided to split the right into conservative voters and reform voters. This is the party that prolific respondents registered when they registered on the platform. So by the time we run the experiment, this might have changed, but we ask them again how you identify, and we use that response to do this. But this was just to create the sample, and it was pretty balanced. Then what we're going to do, we're going to show them two news articles. Both articles are on the same policy, but the way they differ is that one is showing most only quotes from experts. And so here to Orkun's question, experts will be people like scientists, on some policies, former police officers, army officers, etc. Right? So yes, people can assign them a partisan view, but in our context, they didn't. And for the policies we look at, they weren't necessarily seen as being biased on one side or the other, but there's more work we can do on that, on the heterogeneity there. What we really wanted to get at here, and you'll see that it's limiting what we can do in terms of the treatment, is we really wanted to get some genuine news article. We didn't want to create fake vignettes that might not correspond to what people actually read in the news. So I'll show you the vignettes, but these are real BBC News articles, with BBC being ranked by our respondents as the most trusted and sort of most balanced news outlet. And the quotes are, and the articles are edited so that we keep only the quotes of the experts, or we keep only the quotes of the politicians. And then in the debrief, we let the respondents see the entire article. So they know it's edited. They don't know that we've edited it to only show quotes from one side or the other, right? We also have a pure control group, which we don't use very much, but for some of the regressions I'll show you, we use it. And we're going to look at three different policy topics. One is whether smartphones should be banned in schools. Another is whether the government should increase defense spending, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. And the last one is about channel crossing. What's the best policy to address and reduce migrants crossing the channel on small boats? With the idea that there's different levels of perceived technocracy or expertise required for these topics, right? And then we're going to look at how these treatments affect, first of all, who respondents think should deal with this issue. Is this something that should be dealt by the parliament in a referendum or by a committee of experts? Does it affect whether they agree with the policy, whether they're likely to seek more information? This is just reported preferences. We also elicit some incentivized outcomes. In particular, we're going to ask for charity donations, whether they authorize us to donate to one charity or another, but is aligned with one side of the policy or the other. And perhaps the biggest part of the experiment was also trying to elicit what kind of information they want to acquire after being exposed to this first news article. And we think this is important because many of these information experiments sort of expose people to a single vignette in time, right? Maybe capturing some news article, but we know that, you know, in reality, it's not a one-off exposure to a news article that's going to shape your belief. What's going to shape your belief is repeated exposure to a certain type of information. So here, what we're interested in is, you know, how does exposure to one type of information then affect your subsequent acquisition of information, and would that reinforce, you know, that these beliefs that you start to form? Very briefly, what we find is that when people are exposed to the politician quotes treatment relative to the expert quotes treatment, they're going to shift their perception that the policy is more a matter for politicians than for experts. But that effect is largely concentrated on the first policy, the smartphone policy, which at baseline is seen as a more technocratic issue, something that people thought should be dealt with by experts. And then when they see the political treatment, they change their mind and start to think that this should be dealt with by politicians. I'll also show you that it increased somewhat polarization between the two sides of the political landscape on whether they agree with the issue or not. And finally, some interesting results on the choice of information source that are actually have a lot of heterogeneity. So overall, we don't see much effect on which type of news information source they want to choose. But when we split people based on whether at baseline they thought this was more of a technocratic issue or a political issue, we start to see some differences with some people substituting across types of news. So if we show them politician quote, they start to want more expert information, and others having not a substitution effect, but more of a reinforcement. So when they see political news, they want to acquire more political information.
Clement, I have a little question with regards to design. So I'm curious about the choice of, you know, you made this choice of doing politician quotes versus expert quotes. But I think if you're like an avid reader of the news, the surge in quotes, I think the natural counterfactual is also analysis and opinion pieces that kind of have tended to decrease. So I was wondering whether you can elaborate on that choice that you made, where we don't have that analysis component, where people went to the news to get expertise, basically. So I go to the BBC, so because I trust the BBC and I want some kind of trusted anonymous source to have compiled a little literature review and an opinion piece on the issue.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think that's, I mean, it's part of like a broader research agenda around this, but I don't think this is necessarily the right way to resolve that question. But I think the question here is how much of the news is composed of these quotes versus analysis. And what we've realized going through articles trying to generate like the material for these treatments is that actually a lot of articles are really just quotes. So of course, there's a way to present the quotes that creates the right, but a lot of it is actually quotes presented in a very factual way. So this person said that, this person said that, previously they had said this, and so that's kind of what we're focusing on. But I agree with you that there's more to it, right? Sometimes there'll be some analysis from the journalist, some data, some opinions. Is that what you had in mind?
Yeah, because basically, so going back, because you cite Julia Cagé also, she has all these things also on the fact that because news are underfunded, right? So newspapers have lost a lot of funding. Doing live stream type coverage is also cheap. So that's why we see all these quotes, because basically any issue is just, it's just covered as a series of a live stream, and you've got no one paid to do an actual expertise or investigative piece on the evidence. So like the experiment's totally internally consistent, so really no question about that in the way you're presenting it. But I was just curious regarding that choice where we don't think about that other counterfactual, which is analysis, which is what the news to a certain degree are supposed to provide us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And I think it'll be really interesting to look at the news content over time and see how the balance of these three things has evolved, like quotes from experts versus politician versus analysis from the journalist. And I think it's what you're describing, that over time, there's more of the quotes, probably because of the story you're giving of it's cheaper and we don't have the resources. But given that there are a lot of these quotes, that's how we ended up deciding to focus. We did think at some point of this journalist analysis or journalist data treatment to see which one would have more of an impact. But it's when we started researching, finding articles to use, that we realized actually there isn't that much of this material, at least in the policies we looked at.
Thanks.
Okay. I'm running a little bit slow, so contribution. There are a range of papers, mostly in political science, on politicization, and here we want to think of whether media coverage and the quotes, the content that we're looking at, can be a potential driver, and that also feeds into this elite cues and persuasion literature. Thinking about when are experts more persuasive than politicians or vice versa. And then because we do the information acquisition part as well as an outcome, there's a very interesting literature on this, recent information experiments as well, using media report, but where they think more about, people's trade-off for accuracy versus confirmation bias. And whereas here we're thinking about, it's information provision in both cases, but it's information provision on different dimensions, a technical dimension and a political dimension. Okay, I'm going to give you a very brief theoretical framework. I don't want to get too deep into it because it's very high level, and we haven't solved the model thinking about this, and that's something well, we did at some point, but it's not quite where we want it to be. So just to like set ideas, here's how we think about what we're doing. So you can think of policies having two independent dimensions. It's a simplification, but a technical dimension and a political dimension. So you can think of with taxation, you have a equity efficiency trade-off, right? So I know a tax might reduce the size of the pie, but I also care about the distribution, or perhaps I don't, and that's the political dimension. So for the case of smartphones, the technical dimension would be, do they reduce educational attainment? And the political dimension would be, do I believe that schools should be allowed to set their own policies, or the government needs to do that, right? Now you can think that voters face uncertainty about both dimensions. So where the proposed policy fits in this like two-dimensional plan, and they also potentially have different preference weights on these two dimensions. So they're going to be both learning and potentially changing their preferences over this. And so that's one way to think about this, is having two mechanisms. One is the articles we show could be purely framing the issue as political or as technical. And so that would be changing the preference weights. So I discovered that the smartphone policy is actually a big political topic. And it's a bit with the identity activation story that I mentioned earlier, right? So actually, it turns out that conservatives are very in favor of that. So I'm going to put a lot of weight on the political issue. Or I realize the newspapers are only quoting experts on this. So actually, it's a big technical issue. I should really let the experts decide on that. But the other mechanism that's possible is learning. So I learn the exact, or I update on the policy position along these two dimensions, and that makes me change my view on it. That makes me change who should make a decision on this, right? Now, in terms of the outcomes we're looking at, it can potentially have different implications. So if it's purely framing, then in terms of when I choose who should make a decision about this, the political framing will make me think the political dimension is very important. So this is a political issue, so I want politicians to resolve it. Whereas the expert treatment will make me think this is actually a technical issue. I'm going to put more weight on the technical dimension, and I want experts to resolve this question for me. On the polarization, the political framing would increase polarization because suddenly I realize, hey, this is a conservative versus labor thing. I'm conservative, and so I'm going to go with that. I'm going to disagree with that policy, and the other side is going to agree with that policy, whereas the experts will align us better. And I think the more interesting difference between the two stories is the information acquisition part. So if it's a framing story and I start to think this is really a political issue, I'm going to want more political information because I'm really going to want to learn on that dimension to reduce my uncertainty on this dimension, right? And vice versa for the expert. Whereas with the learning story, we have a similar effect on the polarization, but on the news acquisition, we would see a substitution because if I'm learning, you've given me some information on the political position, on the political dimension, and I want to substitute and start learning more about the technical dimension, right? And vice versa, you gave me information on technical dimension, I want to substitute, to move and get information on the political dimension. Okay, so the design, I think you already have an idea of how we did it. I mentioned already the sample. This was the compensation that each respondent got. We also got a bonus, which we use for the incentivization and the eliciting of the beliefs. And then we have a bunch of pre-treatment measures, socioeconomic characteristics, media consumption, their political views, which is going to be one of the most important source of heterogeneity here. So we asked in different ways. The one I'm going to use for the presentation here is their intention to vote. So if there was an election tomorrow, which party would you vote for? And then we're going to split people between Labour on one side and Reform/Conservative on the other. We can do different ways of organizing the data, but that's the one that's split its most balance. We asked them about their trust in different institutions, trust in experts, and also their perceived partisan leaning of institutions and experts. So that's the question that Orkun had earlier. Okay, so free treatment norms, I mentioned them, and the policies, I mentioned them, so let me move on. We elicited some priors. Here, one thing we did, because there's this debate of when you elicit priors, are you creating some experimental demand effect? Because I'm basically asking you, do you think that this issue should be resolved by experts or politicians? When I show you the treatment, I ask you the question again, and you start thinking, what are these guys trying to get me to answer, right? Or you can have also a confirmation bias where consistency bias where you want to answer the same thing. And so to address this, we framed the question slightly differently in the prior. So we gave them a bunch of policies and ranked them according to the most pressing, least pressing. And so we get the priors, but we get them in a different way. If you're curious about that, I'm happy to talk more about how we did that at the end. Okay, so here are the 3 topics. The first one is this banning smartphones. Now, the exact question is a little bit more subtle than what I suggested, because the debate on this issue is actually not just, should smartphones be bad, or are smartphones bad or not? It's a question of whether the government should pass a bill to ban them, or schools should make the decision to ban them. And it's actually a little bit counterintuitive, or not counterintuitive, but against what we might think a priori, which is that Labour is actually more in favor of delegating this decision to schools, whereas the Conservative really want to be tough on this and introduce legislation. We ran a validation survey before the experiment to see that that was an issue that there is some level of disagreement, so where we could push people's beliefs, and people did want some information on this. And then this is not from the validation survey, this is from our actual experiment, but this is pre-treatment. These are people's views on that policy. So what I want to draw your attention to is that, first of all, this isn't a very polarizing issue. Pre-treatment, Labour voters, or people who said they're going to vote for Labour, 50% of them agree with it, whereas Conservative, 48% of them agree with it, right? So it's pretty split. There is disagreement, but it's not politicized, right? The disagreement is not along partisan line. It's also not politicized in the sense that both parties, or people from both parties agree, a large majority of them think that this is something that should be decided by experts and not by the parliament or referendum, right? And then, okay, that's going to be a limit on what we can observe in terms of information acquisition, but only 30% of them wanted more information, but at least some of them did. Yep. And here are the vignettes we showed them. So I'll spend a bit of time on this one, and then the others, policy topics, similar design, so I'll move quicker to get to the results. So on the left, you have sorry if it's a bit small on your screen, but on the left, you have the expert treatment, where the point of the article is kind of similar in both cases. The point is that there are some effects, but it doesn't mean that banning it in schools is going to solve the problems, right? So there's a study by researchers, I think it was in Birmingham, that they showed no differences between schools that banned them and didn't ban them. Don't get it. It's not my place to judge how they did that study and whether we can really identify causality from just comparing schools that ban or don't ban them, but that's what the scientists have found, and that was printed in the BBC, and so that's what we report to our respondents, right? And then on top of it, there's another type of experts, so we also want to have a few different opinions. Someone who's a school head, and that they think it's actually important for students to have their smartphones because they need to be taught how to use their smartphones, so banning them is not going to solve the issue. And then this is the political treatment, where here we're exposing the respondents to this divergence of views between Labour and Conservative. And so these are quotes that are usually coming from debates in Parliament. And so government spokesperson, it's clear that it's Labour, so Labour government has no plans to legislate. And the Labour spokesperson said that schools already do it, so there's no need to legislate on it. But the Conservatives said, no, MPs should be given a phone and the Parliament should decide on banning them, right? So that's kind of the divergence between the two. So expert treatment, political treatment. Other than that, they're quite similar, right? Similar length, just diverging views in both cases. But one is only quotes from politicians, the other is only quotes from experts. Kevin, we asked them, do you agree that, essentially, do you agree with the Labour stance on it? So that, but with the Conservative stance on it, so that the government should legislate to ban smartphones in school? How confident are you about your answer? And then, so 1 and 3 are really the two main outcomes where I'm going to show you here is, do you agree with it? And should this be decided by Parliament, a referendum, or a committee of experts? Okay, then we also incentivize some of the outcomes. So this is donations. We did that across the 3 policies. In the smartphone policy, for full disclosure, this didn't work so well because ex post, we realized that it's not so clear in our head, it was clear which of the charities supports, government intervention versus delegating to schools. And we tried to get excerpts from their website to really make that point in the description, but we suspect that respondents didn't read this carefully or didn't process this information carefully. And the reason we think that is that we see very little correlation between the donations and the stated preferences. So donations are not going to be very helpful for this topic, but for the other topics they are helpful. Okay, and we had 2 different ways of doing it, with our own donations or the donation of the respondent. And this, I think, is the sort of more exciting part that we quite enjoy doing, is the information acquisition part. So the information acquisition is incentivized because we ask them, before confirming your choice of donation, you can obtain further information from one of the following sources, right? So the incentive here is that you want to confirm your choice of donation. It's a monetary choice, and so you want to take it seriously. And then you have these 5 possibilities. Sorry, here the logo didn't print out, but the logo is a LSE logo. That's a report from the LSE. And this is going to be our outcome, which is the expert information. So you can either obtain some expert information, or we can obtain what we classified as political or partisan information. So partisan information will be either from traditional media, so The Guardian for sort of left-leaning respondents or the Telegraph for right-leaning respondents, or because we're also curious about that dimension, social media. And we know a lot of people get their news from social media, so maybe they wouldn't react too much to traditional media. So here you also had the choice between getting information from Blue Sky and from X. And since we expected not all respondents to be very familiar with Blue Sky, we kind of primed them to this political dimension by asking them a question earlier on the survey where we said, a large portion of people on X are Reform voters, and a large portion of people on Blue Sky are Labour voters. Do you think that social media platforms are partisan, right? And so that was kind of our way to prime them that, yes, these are left versus right-wing platform, right? But for what I'll show you, the main outcome is whether they clicked on this expert report, the LSE blog, or one of the political information, right? We kept these two blogs rather than actual research papers because we didn't want the decision to be based on how complicated is this going to be to read. It's sort of very similar, like a format of a news article. Okay, I'll go briefly over the other two topics. So defense spending, do you think the government should increase the spending on defense immediately at the expense of education or health? This is also not that politicized. There's relative agreement between the two sides. A lot of people think this is for experts, but less so than for the smartphone policy. These are the vignettes. If you're interested, I can come back to them later. And then the third topic is illegal channel crossing. Do you think we should stop it by tackling smuggling gangs? That's the Labour policy, or by sending asylum seekers to other countries? That's the Conservative policy. And here, this is going to be our topic that is more political to start with, right? So you see a big disagreement between the two parties. And you also see fewer people that think this is a topic for experts to resolve. Right? Still, actually, a sizable portion of people think that, and we were a bit surprised. But compared to the smartphone was 80%, and this is only 50% of people who think that. All right, so let me get to the results now. Okay, so this is just showing you the balance on a range of sociodemographics across treatments, but it was randomized, so there's no reason to expect anything. And then for those that did come out significant, we control for them in some of the specification. It's very simple. We just run the outcome on the treatment. But what we do, I'll tell you when we do one or the other. For a lot of the regressions, we dropped the control group completely. So the control group, remember, was like no information at all, like a pure control. So we drop them, we just compare people who are exposed to the political versus the expert treatment. And so we just have one treatment, which is did being exposed to political relative to expert change your outcome. All right, and that's the first result. So on the politicization of the issue, the outcome variable here is whether the policy should be determined politically or by experts. And in politically, we've combined referendum and parliament. So at some point, we'll look into separating those, but to keep it simple here, do you want either a referendum or politicians to choose it, or do you want experts to make that decision? And what we see, especially on the smartphone issue, which remember is the one where on average, at baseline, most people think this is an issue for experts, not for politicians. Only 30% of them think it's for politicians. When they see the political treatment, so the quotes from politicians, they start to think that this is actually an issue for politicians and not for experts, right? On the defense policy, this is not so clear, right? There's positive coefficients, but they're very noisy. They're much closer to zero. So there doesn't seem to be this effect on a policy that is relatively less technocratic. And on the policy that's very not perceived as technocratic, we now see kind of a divergence in preferences over the venue, over who should decide the policy across parties. So Labour thinks that this should be decided by politicians, whereas Conservatives, it's noisy, but they tend to prefer that this should be decided by experts, right? Now to show you,
can I have just to calm down my thoughts? So when you tell people about experts or that experts are going to do this, and then you might think that there's some kind of consensus in the background. Okay, hopefully it's informed by real life. When you ask or when people respond, it's politicians who should decide about this. Aren't we worried that the question depends on whose politicians are going to do it, right? So by default, this is a binary system or almost binary system. And if it's my politician, then of course I want him because I want my ideological position to be promoted. But what if, under the headline of a politician, it's the opposite party politicians? Do I really want, if I'm a conservative, do I really want Corbyn to decide about this?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So, and that's something we're still thinking through a little bit, because I agree. There's this, it's kind of this instrumental aspect to the decision of who should decide. So I want someone to decide not because I think they're better, but because I think they're going to agree with me, or that they're more likely to agree with me than the other. And that's something we're still thinking about, how best to disentangle this. One thing that I think could help us here, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, is if we split that political decision between referendum and parliament, that could help a little bit with that, because referendum, presumably you think your decision, it's your decision, right? So you'll have a voice. And so, but I guess it depends a bit whether you expect your view to represent a majority of the country or not.
So since you invited, and I had an earlier thought a few minutes ago or some time ago, referendum is a tricky thing in the UK since the Brexit referendum. People may just dislike the whole idea of it, but there's an idea of citizen assembly, which is like a appeal to general public, but it involves less politicization, but more of an expert exposure to inform, what is it, deliberative democracy style. So it's taking out politicians as a battle, and including media, by the way, as well. More focusing on what my neighbors, my fellow citizens think about this.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I remember you have some papers on that too, if I remember correctly. And I mean, we are thinking of doing a follow-up experiment to think a little bit about disentangling some of the mechanisms. So that's something we could ask instead of referendum. Another way, I guess, could be to ask sort of higher order beliefs. So do you think most people would agree with you? And then if you do you think the referendum or citizen assembly should resolve that? I think there's Valeria and Orkun.
Yeah, Orkun was there for a while, so go ahead.
Thanks. So I actually was wondering about this last result on the small votes, and I'm surprised to see that conservatives are actually not the ones, kind of increasing their tendency for the issue to be resolved politically, right? When they receive a political narrative or like political quotes, right? In the treatment, I was expecting kind of the opposite, and I was thinking now that you had this discussion with Max, and maybe part of the reason is because now that Labour is in charge, they just don't want the current politicians to solve it, because they basically they're on the opposition side currently. Whether that plays a role in that.
No, that was going to be that's a very good point. That was going to be the other part of my answer to Max as well, which is that one way to think about it, and it's not foolproof because we don't know how people actually think about answering that question, but I would think, do they agree with what Labour proposes? And the assumption would be, when we ask them, do you think this should be resolved politically, they'll think, should this be resolved by the current parliament, by the current government? And in that case, then we can split people. If they agree with the Labour policy and they don't think it should be resolved by the parliament, then it's an indication that it's not an instrumental choice. It's driven by something else. Valeria, you had a question?
Yeah, my question is like I guess has a flavor of the same question, which is, going to this problem of when people say, oh, this has to be decided by experts, actually what they want is to diffuse the problem. So it's not the current government that's answering. And really, I think the way to answer my question would be to get a sense of what people actually understand by a policy that's decided by experts. Because in the context of the UK, now that we're outside of European Union, to be honest with you, I I can't give you an example of what would be a policy decided by experts. Like in practice, what does that look like? In Europe, we know that's like, oh, that's the Brussels policy. Some kind of person with a PhD that I don't know who it is decided that we shouldn't emit emissions above X. But in the UK, at the end of the day, all of these policies end up with some kind of parliamentary debate. So what is a policy decided by experts? And what is it that people have in mind when we're asking this question?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, because it's true that like few policies would be purely decided by experts. I guess what we had in mind, I mean, one scenario would be to think that to the respondent, this is purely hypothetical. So if we could have an institution where experts make these decisions, would you want it? But if they want to think about it within the context of existing UK institutions, you could think, for example, I mean, it's not one of the topics we had here, but it is a topic we had in one of the pilots, which is inflation and interest rates, right? So that is a policy that's decided by experts, this central bank monetary policy, but it is a bit of an extreme case because central bank independence is a big thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's like regulated for it to be independent.
Yeah. So another one also that, again, was in the pilot, but not in this one because the news cycle changes fast, was about the COVID, actually. And one of the things that motivated us for this project was thinking back to, Boris Johnson flanked by the two medical advisors and sort of how much were they giving him credibility. And so it's not that they would make the ultimate decision, but it's that, the politicians would follow the recommendations of the experts. So it's a little bit what we had in mind of like, it's not necessarily in practice a bill that's not decided by politicians, but do you want politicians to just follow what the civil servants or what the experts are telling them, or do you want them to debate among themselves? But of course, it's not as black or white in reality, right?
This shapes like a nice discussion to have after the...
Okay. I'll just move to my last set of slides for the last 5 minutes. So this is on who should decide a policy. Here, I just want to show you, it's a bit noisy because we're starting to cut things, but splitting by treatment. So what's the effect of the political treatment versus the expert treatment? And since there's not much going on in the defense for the rest of the talk, I'll just show you the smartphone and small boats, but I have all the others if you're interested. What I want to show you here is that on the smartphone, it is that the political treatment increases your belief that it should be political, and the expert treatment decreases that you think this should be political. Whereas for the small boats, it's not so clear, right? Conservative is really not much going on. It's very close to zero. But if anything, this is positive. And for labor, this is not that one is positive, the other is negative. It's again, one has a zero effect and the other has a positive effect, right? So it's a bit of a different effect of the difference between politician and experts. What I also wanted to show you here is that the effect, so thinking about controlling for the prior. So it's not that people had opinions about this and that just reinforced their opinion. This is the effect of the treatment on people who switch their opinion. So people whose prior was that this should be a decision made by experts, but then they see the political treatment and they change their opinion to think this should be made by policymakers and vice versa. And we see that the effect is larger for those switching from thinking this was actually an expert topic and now they think it's a political topic. Okay, the second set of results is about polarization. And I showed you that in the prior pre-treatment, there was relatively little difference between the two parties. Here I'm showing something different. I'm showing you the control, and I'm showing you the difference between the expert and the political treatment. And what you can see here is that in the control group, there's about a 5 percentage point difference between Labour and the Conservatives on the question of who should decide on whether smartphones should be banned or not. In the expert treatment is very similar to the control group, only a 4 percentage point difference. But in the political treatment, that difference increases to 13 percentage point, right? And so it's in that sense that the political treatment creates some polarization relative to the expert treatment, right? Initially, we thought maybe it's not so surprising because you do see, two different opinions according to parties, but maybe, it's also that we're very primed to thinking that people do listen to politicians that they agree with, right? And this is confirming that people do follow to some extent what their politician thinks. And that's one of the reasons that these more politically oriented articles create this polarization across voters, right? We see it too with the channel crossing policies. So there's more polarization to start with between the two parties, but even then, the expert treatment increases it a little bit. So here we need to think about there's something happening with the expert treatment that is changing people's view on the policy. But then there's an even larger increase with the political treatment, right? So relative to the control group, the political treatment has 13 percentage point more polarization or divergence between the two groups. And this is confirmed, by the way, with the donation data. So this is when we ask them, do you approve us making a donation to a charity supporting migrants or not? And when they see the political treatment, the difference between labor and conservative is larger than in the control group or in the expert treatment, right? And same when we ask them if they want to make a donation out of their bonus, that donation difference between labor and conservative also increases as a result of the political treatment. Okay, and the third set of results is about the type of information. So this shows you that on average, overall, there is not really anything going on in terms of treatment effect on information source. Remember, this is the, do you want to click on The Guardian, on X, etc., right? But once we split people based on whether at baseline they thought this was more of a technical issue, or like, do you think that this should be an issue resolved by committee of experts or politicians, we start to see some differences. And in particular, depending on this prior, there could be either of the two stories I mentioned earlier, the priming or the learning. So for smartphone, for example, people who at baseline thought this was more of a political issue, when they see the political treatment, they double down and they start acquiring more political information. So either clicking on The Guardian, The Telegraph, or the X or Blue Sky. Whereas when they see the expert treatment, they're more likely to go and click on the LSE report. Right? So these guys kind of, the political treatment makes them double down, and the expert treatment makes them switch to more expert information. Whereas for those who at baseline thought this was more of a technocratic decision and thought they preferred experts to resolve the question, when they see the political treatment, now they substitute. They've learned what politicians learn about this, think about this, and now they go and read the expert report, the LSE blog or IFS blog that we had in the other topic, right? So that's what happens for the smartphone policy for the labor voters, but not so much for the conservative voters. And for small votes, it's kind of reverse, which is interesting. So for labor voters, it's those who had an ex ante preference for expert who start to double down when they see political information. They want to get more political information. And instead, those who had a preference for, who thought ex ante that was more of a political issue, when they see the political treatment, they start to want to learn what the experts want to think about, right? So there's this interesting like heterogeneity and different direction of the effects that we want to dig into a little bit more. So I should have said that at the start, but this is a very early work in progress. So we're still trying to make sense of the results and the analysis. And so all that feedback is super helpful, and especially like trying to think about how we can make sense of that. One thing we want to do here is we want to start looking at what type of media they looked at when they did look at the partisan media, whether they looked at social media, whether they looked at traditional media. We also want to look at whether they looked at media that's aligned with their political preferences or not. Just looking at the descriptive is quite interesting because we thought, everyone who's like a conservative or reform voter will just go read the Telegraph or on X. But actually, a lot of people just go and look at what the other party thinks or what the other side thinks, even though it's not their preferred source of opinion. And so we want to see whether any of the treatments had an effect on whether people read misaligned information, which was also a big source of polarization in these sort of echo chambers. So yeah, I'll stop here. I think I'm getting to the end of the hour anyway. So just to recap, whether media quotes politicians or experts can politicize an issue, so turn some issue that was seen as a more expert-driven issue into a more political issue. It can also affect polarization, and the effect will depend on the party affiliation, on the prior views, and it can lead to some interesting substitution of the type of information you want to read as a result of this treatment. Okay, I'll stop here. Happy to take questions now.
Well, thank you very much. So please join me in thanking Clement. So maybe what I can do, we're at the hour, so I'm going to stop the recording. And if people have some more informal questions that they want to ask, and if you have a little bit of time, maybe, I don't know if you want to take them.
Yeah. I have time, so I'm happy to stick around. Good. But
so I'll stop the recording now.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm not stopping it. Yeah, stop the recording instead of stopping the meeting.